Imagine a world-renowned grandmaster in a $5,000 suit losing his composure to a girl in dirt-stained overalls who doesn't even own a clock. The horizon over the Johnson farm was a jagged line of rusted silos and heat-shimmered cotton that morning. In the bed of the family's dented Ford, crates of summer squash were stacked high, bound for the city markets. 12-year-old Tanisha Johnson wore a pair of oversized denim overalls that had seen 3 different harvests. She sat perfectly still, her small hand protectively covering a single wooden pawn tucked into her pocket. They were pulling into the city, a place of glass towers and limestone facades where men wore silk ties and spoke in the clipped, fast tones of people who valued time more than people. "Stay with the truck, Tanisha. I'll be back after the delivery," her father said, his voice gravelly from years of field work. But Tanisha's curiosity was a living thing. She drifted away from the loading docks until she reached a heavy mahogany door marked with the gold crest of the Metropolitan Chess Club. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thump-click of professional timers. In the center of the hall, at a table that shone like a dark mirror, sat a pristine set of ivory and ebony pieces. They stood in perfect formation, a silent army awaiting a general. Tanisha hovered at the edge of the velvet rope, her eyes moving across the board with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. She looked like a small, dusty bird that had accidentally flown into a cathedral. "The knight is the only one that can jump the fence," a voice said, cool and authoritative. Stephen Waller was leaning back in his chair, a leather-bound journal of Grandmaster games on the table. His blue eyes were as sharp and cold as a winter morning. He was the king of this world, a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless, mathematical precision. Tanisha didn't blink. "My grandma said it's because the knight knows the rhythm of the field better than the king," she replied softly. Waller's lips quirked into a patronizing smile. "Is that so? Why don't you show me that rhythm? Just for fun." A few moments later, Tanisha reached out with a hand still stained by the morning's harvest and moved her pawn to d4. Waller's eyebrows shot up. He didn't expect a farm girl to know a queen's pawn opening. By the 15th move, the room had begun to tilt. Tanisha wasn't playing from a book. She was moving with an unbroken rhythm that bypassed every trap Waller set. She executed a daring, non-textbook knight maneuver that felt more like a dance than a strategic pivot. On move 22, Tanisha slid her rook across the board, pinning Waller's king against his own greed. The Grandmaster leaned back, his face turning the color of ash as he realized he was trapped. A suffocating silence fell over the mahogany room. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "In the dirt," Tanisha said, standing tall among the Ivy League spectators. "Where the sun shows you the moves before you even touch the piece." Waller couldn't look away, haunted by a single thought. How had such a brilliant light grown in a place he had always called empty? The drive to Reeves County was a 3-hour penance of heat and humming tires that Stephen Waller spent replaying the final moments of their match. He had spent 30 years perfecting a cold, crystalline logic, yet a 12-year-old girl in dirt-stained overalls had shattered his equilibrium with a single, soulful rook lift. He gripped the steering wheel of his European sedan, feeling the luxury of the leather interior grow increasingly absurd as the glass towers of the city gave way to the jagged line of rusted silos and heat-shimmered cotton. He wasn't entirely sure why he was coming, only that the silence he had felt in the Metropolitan Chess Club was still ringing in his ears, and the red ink of his own initial arrogance demanded a retraction. The Johnson farm appeared like a stubborn survivor against the vast, dry horizon. It was a landscape of sun-bleached wood and cottonwoods bent by a wind that never seemed to rest. When Stephen pulled his car onto the gravel driveway, the sound of the engine dying felt like a heavy intrusion into a space that operated on a much older, slower clock. He stepped out, his polished shoes immediately coated in a fine layer of Texas dust, and looked around for the girl who had made him feel like a novice for the first time in decades. He didn't find Aisha at the house, nor in the barn where the scent of sweet hay and old rain lingered. Instead, he followed a narrow path behind the porch that led to a clearing beneath a massive, ancient pecan tree. There, he stopped, his breath catching in his throat as he witnessed a sight that no Grandmaster manual could have prepared him for. Aisha was kneeling in the dirt, her back to him, moving with the same unbroken rhythm he had seen in the city. But there was no mahogany table here, and no ivory pieces. Scratched into the dark, packed earth was a perfect 8x8 grid, a 6-4 square world etched with a sharpened stick. For pieces, she used the raw materials of the land, smooth river stones for pawns, snapped twigs for rooks, and dried sorghum husks for bishops. It was a geometric soul laid bare upon the soil. "You're playing the King's Indian," Stephen said softly, careful not to break the spell. Aisha didn't flinch. She placed a flat stone on the dirt board and looked back over her shoulder, her eyes reflecting the vast, watchful sky. "Grandma said the King's Indian is like the weather out here. It looks quiet until it isn't." Stephen walked closer, kneeling in the dust despite the cost of his suit, finally realizing that he had come to the Johnson farm not just to apologize, but to fix a part of himself he hadn't known was broken. He looked at the dirt board, seeing the patterns she had mapped, not as memoized lines from a database, but as a language of survival. "I came to tell you that I was wrong, Aisha. About your style. About everything." Aisha traced the edge of a square with her finger, her expression contemplative and grounded. "You thought I was just guessing. But Grandma and we played here every night before she got too tired. She said the dirt is the only board that doesn't lie to you. If you make a mistake, the wind just blows it away, and you start again." Stephen reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched a twig she had designated as a rook. He realized that while he had spent his life chasing trophies and ratings, Aisha had been building a world of memory and possibility. She wasn't just playing a game. She was maintaining a conversation with a woman who had taught her to see the board in the stars. The late afternoon sun spilled gold over the field, illuminating the grit and the grace of the girl sitting across from him. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the click of a grasshopper from the edge of the porch. Stephen looked at the dirt-etched squares and realized that the rural geometry Tanisha possessed was a gift of tenderness, an intelligence that refused to be made smaller by the rigid protocols of his world. "I didn't come to teach you how to win," Stephen whispered, his voice thick with a realization that made the 3-hour drive feel like a pilgrimage. "I think I came here so you could teach me how to play." Tanisha smiled, a look that was both tired and full, and handed him a small, white river stone. "Then you better keep your eyes on the knight, Professor. In the dirt, he jumps where the rules say he shouldn't." Together, beneath the shadow of the pecan tree, the Grandmaster and the farm girl began a new match, one where the score didn't matter, and the only victory was the unbroken rhythm of two souls finally speaking the same language. The transition from the sun-drenched silence of Reeves County to the pressurized atmosphere of the Metropolitan Chess Club felt like a slow suffocation of the spirit. Tanisha sat in a room that smelled of lemon polish and expensive wool, her back stiff against a chair that cost more than her father's tractor. Gone were the river stones and the warm, receptive soil of the pecan grove. In their place were weighted plastic pieces and a digital clock that pulsed with a red, unblinking glare. Stephen Waller stood over her, no longer the man who had knelt in the Texas dust, but once again the Grandmaster of crystalline logic. "The Sicilian Najdorf is not a suggestion, Tanisha," Stephen said, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "It is a conversation with centuries of precedent. If you move the knight to e5 here, you aren't being creative. You are being incorrect." He tapped a heavy finger on the board, pointing to a sequence of moves printed in a thick, leather-bound manual. To Stephen, these were the access protocols of the elite, the standard by which a genius was measured. Tanisha stared at the board, but she didn't see the lines of theory Stephen was trying to etch into her mind. Her geometric soul was looking for the rhythm, the hidden pulse of the pieces that her grandmother had taught her to hear. In her mind, the board was still a field where the wind dictated the tempo, but here, the air was stagnant. She felt like a polished pawn, a piece being moved by a hand that wasn't her own, forced into a rigid geometry that felt jagged and foreign. "It feels like holding my breath," she whispered, her fingers hovering over a bishop. "When I play the way you want, I can't hear what the pieces are thinking. I'm just following a map for a place I've never been." Stephen sighed, a sound of weary patience. "The map is what keeps you from falling off the edge, Tanisha. Your wild instincts are brilliant against amateurs, but the grandmasters will eat them alive if they aren't anchored in formal proof." He was grooming her for a world that rewarded noise and precision, a system that demanded a birth certificate and a transcript before it would acknowledge a soul. He wanted her to be unshakable, but in his pursuit of her perfection, he was inadvertently making her smaller instead of bigger. Hours bled into days of if not then drills and memorized endgames. Tanisha spent her afternoons in the city library, surrounded by more books than she had ever seen, yet she felt more illiterate than ever. She would close her eyes and try to summon the knight's veil or the spiral patterns she had drawn in the dirt, but the digital thump click of the club's clocks kept intruding, shattering her focus like glass. One evening, after a particularly grueling session where Stephen had corrected her every move with a sharp, "No, that's too speculative," Tanisha sat alone at the practice table. She looked at her hands, clean now, the dirt of the farm scrubbed away, and realized she missed the grit. She missed the way a pebble felt in her palm and the way a match could end in a quiet draw that felt like a victory of understanding. Stephen watched her from the doorway, his own chest feeling heavy with a conflict he couldn't quite name. He saw the tired eyes of a girl who was winning her games but losing her joy. He remembered Clara Walker, the student he had once failed because her metaphors didn't fit his margins, and a cold fear began to settle in his gut. He was trying to give Tanisha the armor she needed to survive the ivy wall, but he was beginning to realize that the armor might be too heavy for her to move. "Am I doing it right yet?" Tanisha asked without looking up, her voice devoid of its usual melodic spark. Stephen looked at the board, where she had executed a flawless, textbook-perfect defense. It was exactly what he had asked for, measured, solid, and entirely lifeless. "You're playing like a grandmaster, Tanisha," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Then why does it feel like I'm losing?" she replied softly. She picked up a white pawn, turning it over in her hand, searching for the rhythm she had left behind in the Texas dust, wondering if she could ever be both the polished pawn the city demanded and the girl who knew how the night moves. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a labyrinth of crystal chandeliers and soaring ceilings that seemed designed to make anyone from a place like POS, Texas, feel like an ant beneath a microscope. Tanisha stood at the edge of the velvet-draped buffet line, her feet aching in the stiff, patent leather shoes Stephen had insisted on buying for the pre-tournament gala. She wore a dress of navy silk that felt like a costume, a polished shell meant to hide the girl who preferred the rough canvas of overalls and the honest dust of the farm. Around her, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of champagne. The guests were a sea of leather watch bands and pressed slacks, their voices a low hum of academic jargon and inherited confidence. Stephen was across the room, cornered by a group of donors, his face fixed in a mask of practiced diplomacy. He looked like he belonged here. Tanisha felt like a question in motion that no one in the room wanted to answer. "So, this is Waller's little miracle from the dirt," a voice drawled behind her, cutting through the classical music like a serrated blade. Tanisha turned to see Dr. Marcus Eloy, a man whose suit was as sharp as his critiques and whose eyes held the cold light of academic liability. He was flanked by a group of graduate students who looked at Tanisha with a mixture of pity and amusement. "I've seen your record, Tanisha," Eloy continued, leaning in close enough for her to see the smirk he used for things he deemed uncredentialed. "It's charming, really. a natural cognition for spatial reasoning in someone so unsupervised. But tell me, do they even have a library where you're from, or do you just find your patterns in the clouds? One of the students chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering over marble. I heard she plays with pebbles, the boy whispered, not quite quietly enough. Hard to imagine her handling a real ivory set without getting it filthy. Look at her cuticles. You can't scrub out that kind of background. Tanisha looked down at her hands. No matter how much lemon soap she had used at the hotel, her nails still bore the faint, stubborn crescent of Reeves County soil, the dirt under her nails that served as a silent birth certificate. To these people, it wasn't a mark of hard work or the geometry of the soil. It was a stain of retaliation against their standards. The dirt is where things grow, Tanisha said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. My mama said some places make you smaller instead of bigger. I think this might be one of them. Ellie's smile didn't reach his eyes. A sharp tongue for a guest without a transcript. But remember, girl, chess is a game of kings and grandmasters. It requires a certain pedigree. You can win every match on the board, but you'll find the door to the club is much harder to checkmate than the pieces. The glass ceiling wasn't a metaphor to Tanisha in that moment. It was the physical weight of the room's judgment, a retaliation for the sin of being brilliant without the proper paperwork. She realized then that to the elite, she wasn't a peer or a prodigy. She was a favoritism project, an undocumented minor whose work was unverifiable because it lacked a zip code they recognized. She looked across the room at Stephen, who was laughing at a joke made by the dean, oblivious to the sharpened words being used to dismantle his student. A wave of profound quiet washed over her, the same stillness she felt before a blizzard hit the farm. She realized that no matter how many grandmasters she defeated, to people like Ellery, she would always be the farm kid who didn't know how to castle properly. "Excuse me," she whispered, turning away from the circle of critics. She didn't run, but she didn't stop until she reached the balcony overlooking the city lights. The wind was high and cold, lacking the earthy perfume of hay but carrying the same restless energy. She gripped the cold stone railing, her tired eyes watching the rhythmic motion of the traffic below. She felt like a piece left behind, a knight that had jumped into a circle of bishops only to realize they didn't play by the same rules of honor. In the distance, she could almost see the sun-hardened fields of POS, where a leaky roof was the only thing that could stop a game. She touched the silk of her dress and realized it felt like a cage. The realization settled deep in her chest, heavy as a stone. Victory on their board would never be enough to win her a seat at their table. If she wanted to play a game that was fair, she would have to make her own board where the ones without names could finally breathe. The train ride back to Reeves County was a blur of shifting landscapes, a long, rhythmic transition from the vertical steel of the city to the horizontal freedom of the plains. Tanisha sat by the window, the navy silk dress folded away in her bag like a discarded skin. She was back in her denim overalls, but the weight in her chest hadn't lightened. In her mind, the 64 squares of the chessboard had become a cage of rigid opening theories and access protocols that left no room for the spirit. She felt as if the game she loved, the one that whispered to her in the patterns of the clouds, had been replaced by a cold, digital clock that only knew how to count down to her next mistake. When she stepped off the bus at the POS stop, the air was dry and gentle, smelling of sunburned grain and the promise of a long, slow evening. There were no leather watch bands or sharpened words here. Her father's truck rattled over the gravel, a sound of survival that felt more honest than the hushed silence of the Metropolitan Chess Club. As they drove past the familiar rows of heirloom corn, Tanisha felt a profound, quiet resignation. She wasn't giving up on chess. She was giving up on the version of chess that made her feel smaller instead of bigger. Back at the farmhouse, she didn't touch her board. She spent her days shelling corn and hauling buckets, grounding herself in the physical labor of the land. Her grandfather watched her from the porch, his eyes full and watchful, but he didn't ask about the tournaments or the grandmasters. He knew that sometimes a piece left behind needs time to remember why it started moving in the first place. 3 days later, Stephen Waller arrived. He looked out of place in his $5,000 suit, standing in the middle of a dust field with a second-hand chess set tucked under his arm. He found Tanisha by the old pecan tree, the spot where the geometry of the soil had first unstitched his arrogance. "I didn't come to talk about the Najdorf," Stephen said, his voice gentle but clear against the rustle of the leaves. Tanisha didn't look up from the dirt she was tracing with a stick. "Then why are you here, Professor? The city is where the real chess happens. Out here, it's just stones and twigs." Stephen sat down on the sun-hardened grass, ignoring the dust that clung to his expensive trousers. He had spent the long drive from Cambridge realizing that he had spent his life as a coach of players, maneuvering people like pieces to achieve a victory of precision. But looking at Tanisha's tired eyes, he realized he needed to be a coach of souls. He saw now that he had nearly failed a student just as he had failed Clara Walker years ago, by valuing the formal proof over the elegant, quiet instinct. "I was wrong to try and polish the grit out of you, Tanisha," he whispered, the words a heavy silence between them. "The grandmasters don't own the game. You do. Your grandmother did. This dirt does." Tanisha finally looked at him, her wide eyes searching his face for a frown or a smirk, but she only found a quiet storm cloud of regret. "They said I didn't have the paperwork, Stephen. They said I was a liability." "They are the ones who are smaller," Stephen replied, handing her a white pawn from his travel set. "I realize that if I only teach you how to win, I'm just helping them build a wall. But if I teach you how to stay yourself, we change the game forever." He didn't pull out a textbook or a clock. Instead, he took a stick and drew a single, unthreatening spiral in the dust. "Tell me about the night's rhythm again," he said. "Not the move from the book. The move from the clouds." A faint smile touched Tanisha's lips, the first joy he had seen in her since the city. She realized that Stephen wasn't there to drag her back to the ivy wall. He was there to kneel in the soil and remember what ground smells like. In that quiet moment of resignation, the old ambition died, and a new second chance was born. The Grandmaster had stopped keeping score, and the farm girl had found her way back to the board, realizing that victory was never the point. Kindness was the only move that truly mattered. The air inside the Austin Convention Center was thin and recycled, a stark contrast to the dry and gentle winds of Reeves County. Tanisha sat at the center of the main hall for the state invitational, her small frame swallowed by the high-backed leather chair. She wore her faded denim jacket over a sun-hardened dress, a silent defiance against the sea of tailored blazers and pressed slacks that filled the room. Across from her sat Victor Langley, a 14-year-old prodigy who arrived with 2 coaches and a practiced calm that felt as cold as glass. Victor was the perfect product of the system, a boy who had memoized every Grandmaster game since 1960 and viewed the board as a formal proof rather than a field of possibility. Stephen Wallace stood in the back of the hall, his gray-blue eyes like quiet storm clouds as he watched his student. He had seen Victor's father, a man with a jaw set like marble, whispering last-minute access protocols into the boy's ear. Stephen didn't move to Tanisha. He knew she didn't need a coach of players today. She needed to trust the unbroken rhythm she had rediscovered in the Texas dust. The arbiter started the clock, the digital thump click echoing like a heartbeat through the hushed hall. Victor opened with the Queen's Gambit, precise, cold, and entirely rehearsed. It was a challenge to her pedigree, a move designed to see if the farm kid had truly learned the standardized scores of the elite. Tanisha felt the familiar pressure of the ivy wall closing in, the sharpened words of men like Dr. Eloy ringing in her ears, telling her she was an undocumented minor in a world of kings. For a moment, Tanisha's hand hovered over her pawn, her fingers trembling with the night of doubt her mother had once warned her about. She looked at the board and saw only rigid opening theories. But then, she closed her eyes and summoned the earthy perfume of hay and the patterns in the clouds from home. She remembered the 6-4 square grid scratched into the dirt beneath the pecan tree. She wasn't playing Victor Langley. She was playing the game her grandmother had taught her, the one where the knight jumps the fence because it knows the rhythm of the soil. Tanisha opened her eyes, and the tiredness vanished, replaced by a focus that had no fear. She moved her knight to an unorthodox fianchetto position, a move that made Victor frown and his father stiffen. It wasn't in the manuals. It was too speculative, an unsupported analogy that defied the limits of formal proofs. "That's not a real opening," Victor whispered, his voice like glass. "It is now," Tanisha replied softly, her voice gentle but clear. As the match progressed, Tanisha began to weave the knight's veil, a technique that used L-shaped leaps to mask where her true pressure lay. She wasn't playing for central power or spatial tension as the textbooks defined them. She was mapping resistance and finding the lonely numbers in Victor's defense. Victor began to squint, his mathematical approach struggling to compute a style that felt like entropy in motion. He was looking for a formula, but Tanisha was giving him a song that always lands on the same note. By move 30, the hall was thick with a heavy silence. Spectators drifted toward their table, sensing a transformation. Victor's rehearsed composure began to crack. He was a trained competitor facing a question in motion. Tanisha advanced her queen, not to dominate, but as a rhythm that forced Victor into a diagonal squeeze he hadn't forecasted. Move 34. Checkmate. Victor stared at the board as if it had betrayed him, his ivory pieces suddenly looking like pebbles in a game he no longer understood. His father turned without a word and left the hall, his pride unable to withstand a defeat by a girl in rubber sandals. Tanisha stood and offered her hand, her wide eyes full of a kindness that Victor wasn't prepared for. "You're not a mistake," Victor whispered, dazed by the unprecedented loss. "No," Tanisha said, her voice echoing the joy of a mind finally free. "I'm just new." She walked out of the hall and found Stephen waiting on the marble steps. He didn't offer a trophy or a recommendation letter. He simply handed her a cold root beer and sat beside her as the wind stirred fallen leaves around them. Tanisha looked at the city skyline and then toward the west, where the dust in POS was waiting. She had won their game, but she knew the next move wouldn't be played on their boards. She had faced the perfect system and found it wanting, realizing that some battles aren't played with sharpened words, but with the courage to remain the kindest genius the world had ever known. The air in the Johnson farmhouse was still, heavy with the scent of lavender and the fine, pervasive dust of the Texas plains. Tanisha sat on the floor of her mother's room, surrounded by the wooden chest that held the fragments of a life interrupted. Her tired eyes scanned the yellowed newspaper clippings and baby blankets until she found it, a thin, silver-framed photograph tucked beneath a stack of old game theory books. The image was grainy, a relic of a time when the world was divided by more than just standardized scores and access protocols. It showed her grandmother, a young woman with a soft jawline and a look of unshakable focus, sitting at a concrete table in a segregated park. There were no leather watch bands or silk ties in this picture. There was only a woman playing chess on a board with chipped paint, surrounded by a wire fence that sought to keep her made smaller. Yet, the way her grandmother held a wooden pawn, with a joy that ignored the sharpened words of the era, spoke to a geometric soul that could not be cast out from the board. Tanisha traced the auburn hair and the wide eyes that so closely mirrored her own. She realized that her grandmother hadn't just taught her the rhythm of the field or how to find patterns in the clouds. She had taught her how to survive a system that viewed her as a liability. The queen's choice wasn't about the move that won the game. It was about the choice to exist with grace and win with humility in a world that expected her to lose. The next morning, as Tanisha returned to the final matches of the Invitational, The ivy wall of academic elitism felt less like a fortress and more like a shell that folds but never closes. She stood before the board, no longer feeling like a polished pawn being moved by Stephen's rigid opening theories. She felt the earthy perfume of hay in her lungs and the unbroken rhythm of her ancestors in her hands. Facing an opponent who moved with mathematical precision and cold, rehearsed logic, Tanisha made her choice. She abandoned the safe line Stephen had coached her on, the one designed to rival advanced undergraduate candidates, and reached for the unorthodox. She moved her knight in a spiral formation, a fractal recursion of a move that no textbook had ever dared to name. It was too speculative, a trick that defied formal proofs, yet it breathed with the life of the Texas dust. "That's not how you play," her opponent muttered, his practiced calm shattering into a frown. "It's how I play," Tanisha replied, her voice gentle but clear, echoing the brave spirit of the woman in the photograph. She began clustering the numbers of the board, not by their size or their central power, but by their change and their resistance. She played like a tree rooted in the ground, while her opponent tried to think like a bird in a storm. On move 42, the same number of years a man in her grandmother's stories had carried a stone before letting go, Tanisha executed a queen's sacrifice. It was a diagonal squeeze that forced her opponent into zugzwang, a position where every move led to entropy. The heavy silence that followed was not one of retaliation, but of slow applause and amazement. Stephen Waller watched from the back of the room, his quiet storm clouds of worry dissolving into a smile. He saw that Tanisha hadn't just won a match, she had reframed the game. She had used her rural geometry to prove that brilliance does not always enter through the front door. When the final checkmate landed, it didn't feel like a crown to chase. It felt like the same note a song lands on no matter where it starts. Tanisha stood, her wide eyes bright with joy, and offered her hand not as a victor, but as a peer. She had found the courage in a yellowed photo to play her own way, realizing that victory was never the point. The point was the kindness of a queen stepping backward to protect the ones without names, ensuring that on her board, no one would ever be left behind again. The last Saturday of summer arrived with a wind that held its breath, a warm, expectant stillness that settled over the Johnson farm as the stars began to pin themselves to the dusk. In the middle of the corn barn, where the scent of sweet hay and old rain lingered, the vertical logic of the city finally met the horizontal soul of the plains. Tanisha sat cross-legged on a canvas tarp, her wide eyes bright with a joy that had nothing to do with trophies or standardized scores. Beside her, Stephen Waller, the man who had once believed brilliance required a $5,000 suit, was kneeling in the dust, helping a 6-year-old boy name his wooden knights. This was the community square, a mobile chess clinic that didn't care about access protocols or paperwork. They had bypassed the traditional title circuit, choosing instead to make their own board, where the ones without names could finally breathe. The 6-to-4 square grid was no longer a battlefield for central power, but a field to share. Around them, 15 local children huddled over boards fashioned from seed sacks. Their unorthodox moves met not with red ink or a smirk, but with the unbroken rhythm of encouragement. Stephen looked across the barn at Aisha, realizing that his second chance hadn't been about winning another tournament, but about becoming a student of a student. He had spent decades as a coach of players, but here, amidst the earthy perfume of hay, he had finally become a coach of souls. He saw Tanisha explaining the Knight's Veil to a young girl, teaching her that the piece moves in an L shape so it can't be blocked by rules. It was the geometry of the soil in motion, a natural cognition that honored the memory of Clara Walker and the woman in the segregated park. "You could be at the national team training camp tonight," Stephen noted quietly, watching a firefly blink like a signal against the dark timber of the barn. Tanisha didn't look up from the white stone she was using to demonstrate a queen's retreat. "I like watching the kids name their pieces better," she replied, her voice gentle but clear. "Mama said intelligence without tenderness is just cold light. I think the light in here is plenty warm." Stephen nodded, his gray-blue eyes no longer quiet storm clouds, but reflective of the joy surrounding them. He realized that Tanisha hadn't come to solve problems for the world of elite chess. She had come to reframe them. Together, they had found common ground, not in the sharpened words of a seminar room, but in the 64 squares drawn in the Texas dust. As the evening deepened, the children began to tuck their painted stones into coffee tins, their laughter echoing like a song that always lands on the same note. Stephen placed a folded paper on the torp, an application for a grant he'd written to fund a dirt chess school that would travel to every leaky roof school in the state. He didn't sign it as a grandmaster, but as a man who had finally learned what ground smells like. "I chose my way to play," Tanisha whispered, looking out at the vast, watchful moon that hung over the rows of heirloom corn. "And on this board, no one gets cast out." Stephen sat beside her, the two of them watching the lanterns flicker like small stars across the prairie. Some victories, they both now understood, don't belong in trophies. Some games are only won when you stop keeping score and start building roots. In the community square, the grandmaster and the farm girl had proven that brilliance is a question in motion, and the best move is always the one that brings someone else to the table. Under the Texas sky, the unbroken rhythm of the game continued, one quiet move at a time, changing everything forever.